The spring air of April 18th, 1775, carried more than the scent of blooming apple trees across the Massachusetts countryside. It carried rebellion. In the shadowy confines of the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, Dr. Joseph Warren hunched over a hastily scribbled message, his physician's hands trembling not from medical fatigue, but from the weight of revolution itself. British General Thomas Gage had finally made his move, and Warren knew that by dawn, the Crown's soldiers would march toward Concord to seize the colonial military supplies hidden there. The intelligence was unmistakable. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith would lead 700 British regulars through the darkness, believing their mission secret, but the Sons of Liberty had eyes everywhere, and Warren's network of patriots had been watching, waiting, preparing for this very moment. The doctor's mind raced as he considered his options. Time was running short, and the fate of the colonial cause hung in the balance like morning mist over the Charles River. Warren dispatched his most trusted riders into the night. Paul Revere, a silversmith whose reputation for swift, reliable service extended far beyond his craft, received the urgent commission. William Dawes, equally committed to the cause, but less celebrated in future songs and stories, would take the alternate route through Roxbury and Cambridge. Their mission was clear: warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying at the parsonage in Lexington, and alert the countryside that the British regulars were marching. As referenced in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study Paul Revere's Ride, the elaborate warning system that unfolded that night represented years of careful planning by the colonial resistance movement. Revere's famous ride was not a solitary heroic journey, but part of a sophisticated communication network that would prove crucial to the events about to unfold. The North Church steeple became a beacon of resistance when Robert Newman climbed the wooden stairs, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the ancient beams. The lights flickered briefly in the darkness, confirming to watchers across the water that the British would cross by sea rather than march overland through the narrow Boston Neck. This simple signal would set in motion a chain of events that would echo through history and transform 13 separate colonies into a unified nation. Fighting for independence, Revere crossed the dark waters of the Charles River in a small boat, muffled oars cutting silently through the current. Behind him, Boston slept under British occupation, unaware that this April night would mark the beginning of 8 years of Revolutionary War. Ahead lay Charlestown, where his horse waited, and beyond that, the winding roads that led to Lexington and Concord, where colonial militiamen would soon make their stand against the most powerful empire on earth. The silversmith's ride began. At 11 that night, his horse's hoofs drumming against the packed earth of country roads. At every farmhouse, every crossroads, every village, the cry went up, "The regulars are coming out." Church bells began to ring in the distance. There, bronze voices carrying the alarm across sleeping townships. The American Revolution had begun not with a declaration or a battle, but with a midnight warning racing through the Massachusetts countryside. The first gray light of April 19th, 1775, revealed Captain John Parker standing on Lexington Common, his weathered hands gripping his musket as he surveyed the 7-7 militiamen who had answered the alarm. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, craftsmen, and shopkeepers who had left warm beds and worried families to stand against the British Empire. Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, understood the gravity of what they faced, but his resolve remained unshaken. The night had been long and confusing. Revere's warning had reached Adams and Hancock safely, but the silversmith himself had been captured by a British patrol near Lincoln. Dawes and Dr. Samuel Prescott had continued the ride, with young Prescott alone managing to reach Concord with the crucial warning. Now, as dawn approached, the fruits of their midnight labor stood assembled on the triangular patch of grass that served as Lexington's town common. Captain Parker's militiamen represented the culmination of decades of growing tension between Crown and colonies. These men had drilled regularly, stockpiled ammunition, and prepared for this moment when resistance would transform from rhetoric into action. They called themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice, and their presence on the common that morning proved they were men of their word. The British column approached with mechanical precision, their redcoats a stark contrast against the pale morning sky. Lieutenant Colonel Smith had divided his forces, sending Major John Pitcairn ahead with 6 companies of light infantry while the main body followed. Pitcairn, a seasoned Marine officer, had expected to find scattered resistance at best, but The sight of organized militia on Lexington Green must have given him pause. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries, but the immediate reality was unmistakable. British regulars and American militiamen faced each other across a piece of New England grass, each side convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Parker, knowing his men were vastly outnumbered, gave what would become one of the most famous orders in American military history. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Major Pitcairn rode forward, shouting commands that mixed military authority with imperial arrogance. Disperse. You rebels, lay down your arms. The morning air hung heavy with tension as the two forces eyed each other warily. Some of Parker's men began to drift away, recognizing the hopelessness of their position. But others held firm, their muskets ready despite the overwhelming odds. The first shot rang out like thunder across the common, though no one could say with certainty which side fired it. Ralph Waldo Emerson would later immortalize this moment as the shot heard round the world. But in the immediate aftermath, there was only chaos, smoke, and the terrifying realization that the die had been cast. British volleys followed in quick succession, and when the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead on the grass where they had made their stand. Among the fallen was Jonathan Harrington, who crawled wounded toward his house at the edge of the common, dying on his own doorstep as his horrified wife and children watched. The symbolism was profound. The first blood of the Revolution had been spilled not on some distant battlefield, but in the heart of a peaceful New England community, on ground where these men had grown up, married, and raised their families. The smoke had barely cleared from Lexington Common when Lieutenant Colonel Smith reformed his column and resumed the march toward Concord. Behind them lay the first casualties of what would become the American Revolution. But ahead waited an even greater confrontation. The British regulars moved with grim determination, their scarlet uniforms now carrying the weight of first blood, while around them the Massachusetts countryside seemed to hold its breath. The 6-mile journey from Lexington to Concord took the British column through rolling farmland that appeared deceptively peaceful in the morning light. But appearances deceived, for Dr. Prescott's midnight warning had reached its destination, and throughout the surrounding towns, church bells continued their urgent summons. Militia companies from Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, and a dozen other communities were converging on Concord, transforming Smith's routine expedition into something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. In Concord itself, frantic preparations had been underway since before dawn. The military supplies that General Gage sought to destroy had already been scattered to hiding places throughout the countryside, buried in furrows, hidden in attics, and concealed in barns miles from their original locations. What remained was either too heavy to move or deliberately left behind to avoid arousing suspicion. The colonists had learned much about deception and misdirection during their years of resistance to British authority. Colonel James Barrett, commanding the Concord militia, faced an agonizing decision as reports of the Lexington skirmish reached him. His force was growing by the hour as companies arrived from neighboring towns, but he lacked the military experience to judge whether they could successfully oppose British regulars in open combat. The memory of British victories in the French and Indian War weighed heavily on colonial minds, despite their growing confidence in their own abilities and their intimate knowledge of the local terrain. As detailed in historical accounts from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the British advance into Concord proceeded according to plan initially, with companies spreading out to search predetermined locations for hidden military stores. Captain Lawrence Parsons led 3 companies toward Baird's farm, while other detachments scoured the town center. The methodical search revealed some supplies, which the soldiers dutifully destroyed, but the bulk of the colonial arsenal had vanished like morning mist. The symbolic heart of the confrontation lay at Concord's North Bridge, a simple wooden span across the meandering Concord River. Here, Captain Walter Larry had posted the companies to secure the British rear, while the main force continued its search. The bridge represented more than a tactical position. It embodied the growing divide between crown and colonies, a physical manifestation of the philosophical chasm that had opened between British authority and American independence. From Punkatasset Hill, overlooking the North Bridge, Colonel Barrett and his growing force of militia watched smoke rising from the town center, where British soldiers were burning confiscated supplies. To the colonists, it appeared their town was being put to the torch, and angry murmurs rippled through their ranks. Major John Buttrick of Concord voiced what many were thinking. They had not assembled simply to watch their community burn, while British soldiers trampled their rights with impunity. The decision to advance toward the North Bridge marked a crucial escalation in the day's events, unlike the confrontation at Lexington, where a small militia force had faced overwhelming odds. The situation at Concord was approaching equilibrium. The colonial force now numbered nearly 400 men, while Laurie commanded fewer than 100 British regulars. The balance of power was shifting, and both sides could sense the change in the morning air like the approaching weather front that would bring afternoon thunderstorms. The advance toward North Bridge began with deliberate caution, as nearly 400 colonial militiamen descended from Punkatasset Hill in a formation that spoke to their growing confidence. Major John Buttrick of Concord led the way, followed by Captain Isaac Davis of Acton, whose company had earned a reputation for discipline and training. Behind them came militia from Bedford, Lincoln, Westford, and Littleton, farmers and craftsmen, who had transformed themselves into citizen soldiers through months of careful preparation. Captain Walter Laurie, commanding the British detachment at the bridge, found himself in an increasingly precarious position as he watched the colonial force approach. His two companies of regulars, numbering fewer than 100 men, had been positioned to guard against retreat, not to face a frontal assault by a force 4 times their size. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Laurie recognized that his options were becoming dangerously limited with each passing minute. The wooden planks of North Bridge bore witness to one of the most significant moments in American history as the two forces converged on this simple river crossing. Unlike the chaos at Lexington Green, where confusion and surprise had dominated, the confrontation at North Bridge unfolded with grim deliberation. Both sides understood what was at stake, and both were prepared to pay the price for their convictions. Major Buttrick's famous command, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake fire," rang out across the Concord River as the colonial militia unleashed their first organized volley against British regulars. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. American colonists were no longer simply resisting British authority through boycotts and protests, but were actively engaging the King's soldiers in armed combat with deadly intent and surprising effectiveness. The British return fire was ragged and ineffective, hampered by their disadvantageous position and the shock of facing such determined opposition. Captain Laurie quickly recognized that his situation was untenable and ordered a fighting withdrawal toward Concord Center. This retreat marked the first time in the growing conflict that British regulars had been forced to yield ground to colonial militia, a precedent that would echo throughout the coming war. Among the British casualties was Lieutenant Edward Gould, wounded in the exchange of fire, while the colonial forces suffered their own losses. The symbolism of armed Americans successfully challenging British military might reverberate far beyond the immediate tactical situation, representing a psychological victory that would prove as important as any strategic advantage gained through the morning's fighting. As noted in historical records preserved by the Concord Free Public Library, the successful colonial action at North Bridge demonstrated that American militia could stand against British regulars under the right circumstances. The confidence gained from this engagement would prove crucial in sustaining the rebellion through the difficult months and years ahead, when colonial forces would face far greater challenges than a single British expedition in the Massachusetts countryside. The retreat from North Bridge marked the beginning of the end for Lieutenant Colonel Smith's mission. What had begun as a routine expedition to confiscate military supplies had evolved into a running battle with an aroused countryside. The British force, now consolidated in Concord Center, faced the sobering reality that their return journey to Boston would be far more perilous than their morning march had been. The colonial militia, emboldened by their success at the bridge, began to organize for the next phase of the confrontation. Leaders like Colonel Barrett understood that they had achieved something remarkable, but they also recognized that the real test lay ahead. The British would have to march 18 miles back to Boston through increasingly hostile territory, and the militia companies gathering throughout the region were preparing to make that journey as difficult as possible. The British withdrawal from Concord commenced at noon on April 19, 1775, as Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith assembled his battered command for what he hoped would be an orderly retreat to Boston. The morning's engagements had cost him casualties and, more importantly, the element of surprise that had characterized his outbound march. Now, as the 700 regulars formed their column on the Concord-Lexington road, Smith faced the sobering reality that every mile back to Boston would be contested by an increasingly organized and confident enemy. The transformation of the colonial response was remarkable to behold. What had begun as scattered militia companies responding to midnight alarms had evolved into a coordinated campaign of harassment that would test British military doctrine in ways no European battlefield had prepared them for. The New England countryside itself became a weapon in colonial hands, with every stone wall, wooded hill, and farm building offering potential cover for marksmen who knew the terrain intimately. The first serious ambush occurred at Miriam's Corner, where the road crossed a narrow bridge and colonial forces had positioned themselves advantageously among the trees and stone walls. The concentrated fire that greeted the British advance guard demonstrated that the morning's lessons had been learned well. American militia could inflict serious casualties on regular troops when they chose their ground carefully and used their superior knowledge of local terrain. Captain Lawrence Parsons, returning from his fruitless search of Colonel Barrett's farm, found himself cut off from the main British force and was compelled to fight his way through increasingly aggressive militia units. His 3 companies suffered casualties and delays that further complicated Smith's tactical situation, stretching the British column and creating additional opportunities for colonial attacks along the route. The British response to these tactics revealed both the strengths and limitations of 18th century military training. The regulars maintained their discipline under fire and executed flanking movements designed to clear colonial positions. But these maneuvers consumed precious time and energy, while the militias simply melted away to reform at the next advantageous position. The British were fighting a European-style battle, while their opponents had adapted their tactics to American conditions. From the detailed accounts preserved in military historian studies, including those found in the collections of the American Battlefield Trust, the British retreat demonstrated the challenges faced by conventional forces when confronted with unconventional warfare. The colonial militia's ability to concentrate fire at chosen points, then disperse before British flanking parties could engage them effectively, presents the guerrilla tactics that would characterize much of the coming Revolutionary War. The psychological impact on the British soldiers was as significant as the physical casualties they sustained. These were veterans of European campaigns, where battles followed established patterns of formation fighting and siege warfare. The constant sniping, the invisible enemy that struck from behind stone walls and disappeared into familiar terrain, created a level of stress and uncertainty that no amount of drill could have prepared them for. At the Hartwell Tavern area, colonial forces had grown to nearly 1,000 men as militia companies continued to arrive from throughout eastern Massachusetts. Dr. Joseph Warren himself had ridden out from Boston to join the fight, demonstrating the level of commitment that the colonial leadership felt toward supporting their citizen soldiers. The rebellion was no longer a matter of individual communities resisting British authority, but was becoming a coordinated regional uprising. The British column began to show signs of serious strain as casualties mounted and ammunition ran low. Smith himself was wounded in the leg, complicating his command responsibilities at a crucial moment. The disciplined retreat was beginning to fray at the edges, as exhausted soldiers struggled to maintain formation while under constant harassment from an enemy they could rarely see clearly enough to engage effectively. The sound of cannon fire rolling across the Massachusetts landscape announced the arrival of British reinforcements. Just as Lieutenant Colonel Smith's battered command approached Lexington for the second time that day, Brigadier General Hugh Percy, responding to Smith's earlier request for support, had marched out of Boston with nearly 1,000 fresh troops and the 6-pounder artillery pieces. The timing of Percy's arrival quite possibly saved Smith's expedition from complete disaster, as the original British force was nearing the point of collapse. After hours of continuous harassment, Percy's relief column represented the largest British military deployment in the colonies since the end of the French and Indian War, demonstrating that General Gage finally understood the seriousness of the situation developing in the Massachusetts countryside. The Brigadier General, a veteran of European campaigns, brought with him not only fresh troops, but also the artillery support that Smith's expedition had lacked. The psychological impact of cannon fire on militia forces was expected to break up the colonial concentrations that had made the morning's retreat so costly. The reunion of the two British forces on Lexington Common, scene of the morning's first bloodshed, provided a brief respite that allowed Smith's exhausted men to rest and resupply. But the colonial militia forces showed no signs of dispersing despite the arrival of British reinforcements. If anything, the presence of additional Crown forces seemed to energize the colonial response, as militia companies that had been arriving throughout the day continued to swell the ranks of those harassing the British retreat. Dr. Joseph Warren's presence among the colonial forces provided crucial leadership and coordination that had been lacking in the early stages of the engagement. The Boston physician, who would later die heroically at Bunker Hill, demonstrated remarkable tactical understanding as he helped organize the various militia companies into a more effective fighting force. His ability to coordinate attacks and maintain pressure on the British column showed that colonial leaders were learning to adapt their political organizing skills to military purposes. Percy's decision to resume the retreat rather than attempt to hold Lexington demonstrated his recognition that the tactical situation continued to favor the colonials despite his reinforcements. The British now commanded nearly 1,700 men, but they remained vulnerable to the same harassment tactics that had plagued Smith's force throughout the morning. The artillery provided some relief by clearing colonial positions, but the militia simply reformed beyond cannon range and continued their attacks. The afternoon fighting took on a different character as both sides adapted to the morning's lessons. The British began using flanking parties more effectively, sending companies out to clear threatening positions before the main column approached. The colonials, meanwhile, began to coordinate their attacks more carefully, concentrating fire at choke points where the British could not easily deploy their superior numbers or bring their artillery to bear effectively. As documented in contemporary accounts, including those preserved in the Massachusetts archives, the level of violence escalated significantly during the afternoon phase of the fighting. The initial restraint shown by both sides gave way to grimmer determination as casualties mounted and the stakes became clear. This was no longer a police action to confiscate military supplies, but an armed rebellion that would determine the future relationship between Crown and colonies. The British retreat through Menotomy proved particularly costly as colonial forces had positioned themselves in houses and behind stone walls along the route. The close-quarters fighting that developed in this area saw some of the fiercest combat of the entire day, with British soldiers forced to clear buildings room by room while under fire from surrounding positions. The tactical complexity of urban warfare in colonial towns tested British training and doctrine in unprecedented ways. Percy's artillery proved crucial in breaking up concentrated colonial attacks, but the guns also slowed the British retreat and consumed additional ammunition that would be difficult to replace if the engagement continued much longer. The brigadier general found himself facing the same tactical dilemma that had plagued Smith. Every mile toward Boston brought fresh colonial reinforcements while weakening his own force. Through casualties and exhaustion, the final phase of the British retreat began as afternoon shadows lengthened across the Massachusetts countryside, transforming the April 19th battlefield into a scene of desperate endurance. General Percy's combined force of nearly 1,700 men faced the longest and most dangerous portion of their journey back to Boston, with colonial militia forces now numbering close to 4,000 and growing stronger with each passing hour. The psychological momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the Americans, who sensed that they were witnessing the humiliation of the world's most powerful military force. The fighting in Menotomy reached unprecedented intensity as British soldiers, pushed beyond the limits of conventional warfare, began breaking into houses suspected of harboring snipers. The close-quarters combat that ensued shocked both sides with its brutality, as the civilized rules of 18th-century European warfare gave way to the harsh realities of revolutionary conflict. Colonial militiamen found themselves fighting, literally in defense of their own homes, while British regulars struggled to adapt to an enemy that refused to meet them in open battle, according to established military conventions. Percy's decision to alter his route toward Charlestown rather than continuing to Boston proper demonstrated tactical flexibility under extreme pressure. The original plan to return via Boston Neck would have required crossing a narrow causeway that colonial forces could easily block, potentially trapping the entire British expedition. By turning toward Charlestown, Percy sought to reach the protection of the Royal Navy ships anchored in Boston Harbor, which could provide covering fire for his embattled command. The colonial pursuit maintained its relentless pressure despite the British route change, with militia companies from Cambridge, Watertown, and surrounding communities converging on the new line of retreat. The speed with which colonial forces adapted to Percy's tactical adjustment demonstrated a level of coordination and communication that surprised British commanders, who had dismissed American military capabilities. The rebels were proving themselves far more formidable opponents than anyone in London had anticipated. As the British column approached Cambridge, exhaustion began to take a serious toll on both officers and enlisted men who had been marching and fighting for nearly 18 hours. Ammunition supplies were running dangerously low, with some companies reduced to using captured colonial powder to maintain their rate of fire. The disciplined retreat that Percy had maintained through superior leadership and the deterrent effect of his artillery was beginning to fray. As individual soldiers reached the limits of human endurance, the final colonial assault came at Prospect Hill, where militia forces made a determined attempt to cut off the British retreat before it could reach the safety of Charlestown Peninsula. This last engagement of the day saw some of the most intense fighting, as colonial commanders recognized their final opportunity to achieve a decisive victory over Crown forces. The British response, though weakened by casualties and exhaustion, demonstrated the professional training that had made them masters of European battlefields for generations. According to historical analyses found in military archives, including those cited by the National Park Service in their comprehensive battlefield studies, the successful British withdrawal to Charlestown represented a tactical victory achieved at enormous strategic cost, while Percy had preserved his force from destruction. The events of April 19th had demonstrated that colonial resistance was both more widespread and more militarily effective than British authorities had believed possible. The sight of British ships in Charlestown harbor provided welcome relief to Percy's battered command as they finally reached safety under the protective guns of the Royal Navy. Behind them lay 18 miles of hostile countryside where colonial militia had proven they could stand against the King's soldiers and inflict serious casualties while sustaining their own fighting capability. Throughout an entire day of combat, the myth of British military invincibility in North America had been shattered forever. As darkness fell over Massachusetts on April 19, 1775, both sides began to assess the day's unprecedented events. The British had lost 273 casualties killed, wounded, and missing, while colonial losses numbered fewer than 100. More importantly, the successful colonial resistance had demonstrated that armed rebellion against British authority was not only possible, but potentially victorious. The American Revolution had truly begun, not with formal declarations or political manifestos, but with the courage of ordinary citizens who chose to stand and fight for their beliefs. On village greens and country roads throughout eastern Massachusetts, the events at Lexington and Concord would resonate far beyond their immediate tactical significance, inspiring colonists throughout North America to believe that independence from British rule was achievable through armed resistance. The citizen soldiers who had answered the midnight alarms and fought throughout that long April day had proven that liberty was worth defending with their lives, establishing a precedent that would sustain the American cause through 8 years of Revolutionary War and ultimately lead to the birth of a new nation founded on the principles they had died to defend.